what is white?
White's if you want to be specific, white isn't really a color, is it?
Yeah, if you want to be specific, right? But who belongs to the white race? Truly, we like to say Europeans, and everybody from America that's white is generally a descendant of European if they're white, right? So the original white race occurred in Europe. I don't know. You're Jewish. You consider yourself white?
I consider myself white as one of the characteristics of myself, white, Jewish, male.
So why does the Jewish race predominate among whites? If you're Jewish, you're Jewish. You're not considered white until you say you're white.
Correct.
It's the Jewish characteristic that seems to predominate among anybody who wants to be racist or who wants to separate you somehow. We don't do that with Christians.
Maybe the number of people represented by that categorization tends to put them in the majority versus the minority.
I'm sorry, who is in the majority?
The Christians.
Oh, yeah, maybe, except that we include atheists in that group too.
Is that right?
I mean, not necessarily as Christians, but as the white majority.
So we've got descriptors. I mean, all of these are descriptors, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, they're demographic identifiers.
And they're a hodgepodge of descriptors.
Yeah.
The descriptors are based on your beliefs or your practices, maybe your genetics, and your genetics are based on your territorial origins, maybe your nationality. All of those things get wrapped up somehow into defining your race.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
How you doing?
Doing okay.
Same here.
Look like you got your muscle shirt on.
Doing some work around the house.
So we got some chatting to do.
It's been a long time. I don't know if I know how to talk about anything anymore.
Yeah, can I call BS on that? But before we get into any formalities, I just want to take a minute to thank Nationwide for their support and continue to appreciate their support that they provide, not just for our podcast, but for the entire veterinary profession. And we look forward to having them as part of our team for the coming year.
All right.
What's on your mind? It's Black History Month. The world continues to be disrupted.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
Yep.
So what's the latest that's bothering you?
It's interesting because I've been reading Frederick Douglass's autobiography. I've been reading a biography on Abraham Lincoln. I've been watching Ken Burns' Civil War. I've been watching Ken Burns' jazz. And you would think I get absolutely nothing done because I've got all of those things on my plate, on top of listening to Whoopi Goldberg implode on The Voice. So nothing much.
Why is Whoopi imploding?
Well, did you hear her anti-Semitic Holocaust comment?
No.
And we won't talk about that today because that's a topic for another time. But she made a comment that, well, it's gotten a lot of negative publicity for Whoopi.
And you got me interested now. What was the comment about?
Let me see if I can find it verbatim because I don't want to misquote Whoopi Goldberg statement on the Holocaust. Okay. Whoopi Goldberg made a comment during Monday's episode of the talk show as she and other hosts were discussing how the Holocaust-centered graphic novel Maus was banned by a Tennessee school, becoming just the latest on a lengthy list of banned books in the US. Personally, I'm shocked because given the story of Maus, I'm surprised that that's what made you uncomfortable. The fact that there was some nudity. It's about the Holocaust to 6 million people. As hosts continue to discuss the banning of books, if you're going to do this, then let's be truthful, because the Holocaust isn't about race, she said. The other host paused before appearing to start to counter her. It's not about race, it's about man's inhumanity to man. That's what it's about, she said. And then they continued on to say the genocide was about white supremacy and going after Jews and Gypsies and Roma. It was two white groups of people. The minute you turn it into race, it goes down this alley. Let's talk about it for what it was. It's how people treat each other. It's a problem. It doesn't matter if you're black or white, because black, white, Jews, everybody. And so I think the minute she said it's not about race is what got people's attention. Are you reading it too?
I am. So in her apology, she corrected that.
Correct. But once the cat's out of the bag,
Unfortunately, in this gotcha era,
right.
that's what happens. And it's got to the point where we have to be too careful. We can't make a verbal mistake and even immediately rephrase it, because the clip could stop at the mistake. And she hasn't said anything we haven't said on this podcast, except for the fact that it wasn't about racism. She tried to elevate the issue to humanism, something we've been talking about all along, but she did a poor job of elevating it, because she tried to compartmentalize the false ideology of race. And in doing so, she suggested that, or she seemed to infer that racism or race is only about color,
right,
rather than the artificial segmentations that we've applied across the board. Are Armenians a race, or are they nationality? Are Jews a race or a religious sect? Is African American a race or a color? And when we choose to discriminate, it kind of doesn't matter.
right,
They are all racists, RACES.
right.
You know, and so once again, we fall into the trap of that false ideology of race. Even, and it's ironic that in this particular case, she was trying to say, well, this was an atrocious, and I don't think this was an anti-Semitic state either. She wasn't comparing it to anything. She was trying to elevate it, but it didn't come out right. There's no way we can say that. And fortunately, she tried to correct.
Yeah, and once the snake's out of the can, or the horse is out of the barn.
The snake out of the can. I like that.
Yeah.
I've never heard that one before, but I'm gonna remember.
Well, it goes back to those kids' games where you had these spring-loaded snakes,
Oh,
and you couldn't get it.
those
Yeah, and they
coiled
would,
snakes.
yes,
Yeah.
they jump out at you.
Okay.
Yeah, I know it's been a while since you were a kid.
Yeah, long time. Yeah, a lot longer than you.
But I think we have a very narrow window these days, and we have to think about what we're going to say when it's in a public forum, and when we're representing, for example, in her case, a TV show. In our case, the variety of different things that we represent. In your case, university. In my case, university and other things. So people are not very forgiving, and they have an ability to take statements, because our history is memorialized, just keep running with them. So if you look at a definition of racist, it says prejudiced against or antagonistic toward a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, typically one that is a minority or marginalized. So when she was kind of hinting at that racism is strictly black against white, she really forgot about a whole era of white against white, black against black, and other groups that have been involved with prejudice and antagonism.
Unfortunately, there was a hidden insult in that statement about whites.
Yes.
But that's because of the white power structure and the recognition that when you think of racism, you think about white versus other races.
Right.
Right. But I still have to inject here that the concept of race is a false ideology to begin with. It's an artificial division to begin with. And so no wonder we get confused. And it also suggests that racism doesn't occur between Black people.
Right.
Or between people of color.
Right.
And we've had the discussion about the African-American Korean history in LA. We haven't talked about racism in Africa itself.
No, but that's what I was thinking about. You got racism in Africa itself.
And I'm not talking about white superiority either.
Right.
I'm talking about tribalism, real tribalism here.
You can look in the Middle East at the Sikhs and the Sunnis.
But they aren't racist, are they?
Oh, well, they are ethnic groups. So
that's right. Exactly. That's my point. We get confused about what is racism, even though that definition includes ethnic groups. It had to.
Right.
It had to. And honestly, and that's what she was saying. It's about man's inhumanity to man. That's what she was trying to say. But then she complicated it with a political statement.
Yeah. Well, the minute she commented that the Holocaust was not a racist event because it was two white groups of people is the minute the flares went up.
Yes, I understand. As if that's never happened, and as if it's never happened between two Hispanic peoples,
Right.
or
Exactly.
two African peoples, or two Chinese peoples. You see, every time we start discussing this ideology, this false ideology, I have to ask the question, what is white?
White's if you want to be specific, white isn't really a color, is it?
Yeah, if you want to be specific, right? But who belongs to the white race? Truly, we like to say Europeans, and everybody from America that's white is generally a descendant of European if they're white, right? So the original white race occurred in Europe. I don't know. You're Jewish. You consider yourself white?
I consider myself white as one of the characteristics of myself, white, Jewish, male.
So why does the Jewish race predominate among whites? If you're Jewish, you're Jewish. You're not considered white until you say you're white.
Correct.
It's the Jewish characteristic that seems to predominate among anybody who wants to be racist or who wants to separate you somehow. We don't do that with Christians.
Maybe the number of people represented by that categorization tends to put them in the majority versus the minority.
I'm sorry, who is in the majority?
The Christians.
Oh, yeah, maybe, except that we include atheists in that group too.
Is that right?
I mean, not necessarily as Christians, but as the white majority.
So we've got descriptors. I mean, all of these are descriptors, aren't they?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
they're demographic identifiers.
And they're a hodgepodge of descriptors.
Yeah.
The descriptors are based on your beliefs or your practices, maybe your genetics, and your genetics are based on your territorial origins, maybe your nationality. All of those things get wrapped up somehow into defining your race.
Yeah, well, it is all of these descriptors tend to become territorialities that you battle for in some cases.
All of these descriptors are just ways to gratify the need to be better than the other person.
It's a segmentation.
Yes.
And we end up battling over segments.
It's a way to identify yourself in a group.
Yeah.
And if you happen to be born with obvious characteristics that others can use to identify you in a group, then they can assign any characteristics they want to you.
Day one or day whenever, there was no segmentation. We were all the same. We didn't have groups, but over time,
yes,
these different demographic.
We began to assign characteristics, and they began with, if you were born in a house in a part of a city where all the servants live, then you're going to be a servant.
Right. You've got the demographics that, hey, you're a Mississippian. I'm a New Yorker. Right now, we're both California. I'm tall. You're a little bit shorter. We've got all of these different descriptors that cubbyhole us or categorize us, but don't really talk about the humanism side of it and the person. That's the psychographic measures versus the demographic measures.
And that's why I go back, and that's why I said that these descriptors that we hold on to the most are the ones that allow us, for whatever reason, for whatever result, it allow us to feel better about ourselves. I think the book is called Courageous Conversations. No, Crucial Conversations.
Right.
And in that book, they describe the commonality among human beings to promote themselves. I think it's part of our ability to be resilient. But to be humanistic is our ability to control that urge. It's our ability to recognize that it's one thing to be confident. It's one thing to be resilient. It's one thing to understand that I have the mental capacity and strength to deal with most serious challenges I may have in my life. It's another to base that on being better than you. You know, it's another to tell myself that I'm better than you for this reason, and therefore you don't deserve what I deserve.
So if we look at the human as a social animal, then the developments of these groups, whether they're city, suburban, rural, whether they're religious groups, whether they are, I'm a Yankees fan and you're an Atlanta Braves fan, the development of these groups actually brought people together and started to segment. And then there started to become a battle for which segment was more relevant, for lack of a better way to put it. Religious,
Well,
color, whatever.
These politically charged characteristics, these politically charged differences didn't just happen. When we were hunters and gatherers, we found out that we could bring down the bison better as a group.
Right.
And so our family units became bigger. We became wanderers, hunters as a group.
Right.
But then we began to become distrustful of other groups.
Right.
And as a group, we had to figure out who we were going to trust in other groups or not.
Right.
I was watching a Nova documentary on the Mayan culture and how they developed trade between the small villages. They're not focusing so much on the leaders of the culture now, but on the villagers themselves and the things that they believe. But I found it interesting in how they interacted with other villages. And they learned at some point and trade taught them how to get along with other villages. Just as we don't want to go to war with China because all of our goods come from there. But we also recognize that we become too dependent on a global economy, and we can't even make our own masks when we need to protect ourselves in a pandemic. So there has to be a balance, and markets are messy, and you always bounce from fast to famine, from surplus to deficits, from inflation to depression. And you can mitigate the depths that you go to on either end of the spectrum by recognizing signs, historical signs that indicate you're moving past the middle of the pendulum. So we did this, we developed these dependencies on characteristics, just as economists look at historical signs to determine whether or not inflation is about to be out of control. But we put value on some characteristics that don't have any, that are not valid as indicators as whether or not this community should be your friend or not, or the person who belongs to that community is as good as you, because it's complicated by our own individual's psychology.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.